Hello,
Hola a
everyone.
todos.
And if not, I don't know. Well,
Bueno,
I had a presentation
hoy
planned today,
tenía
but as in
un plan
Argentina
de
things happen.
presentación, pero como en Argentina pasan cosas, eh,
I had
tuve
to
que
modify the
modificar un poco
presentation a little, and I want to
la
start the presentation
presentación
with a phrase from the former president of the
y,
nation, Cristina Fernández de Kirchner, that
y
says
quiero arrancar
Argentina is
la
that strange place
presentación
where even the obvious must be
con
explained.
una frase de la expresidente de la Nación, Cristina Fernández de Kirchner, que dice: Argentina es ese extraño lugar en donde hasta lo obvio debe ser explicado.
So
Así
it is
que,
that given the
dadas
aberrations and
las
inconsistencies that your
aberraciones
letter has
e
today, and
inconsistencias que
all the
tiene su
damage it has
carta
caused to Argentina,
de hoy y todo el daño que le ha causado a la Argentina,
well,
bueno,
I'm
voy
going
a
to
tener que
have
estar
to be
explicando
explaining
cosas
obvious
obvias.
things. So it
Así
is
que,
for Chris.
para Chris,
Hi,
saludos
Chris, this
Chris,
is
esta
for
va
you.
para vos. La
Today's talk
charla
basically about
de
what
hoy
I'm going to explain
básicamente
is what is the approach that
sobre
we
lo que
have to
voy a
determine
explicar
to definitively
es
eradicate inflation in Argentina.
cuál es el enfoque que nosotros tenemos para determinar de erradicar definitivamente la inflación en la Argentina.
And
Y
that implies
eso
a
implica
description
una
of initial
definición de
conditions,
condiciones
a
iniciales, un
diagnosis, and a
diagnóstico
monetary
y un
policy design.
diseño de política monetaria. Por lo
Therefore, the
tanto,
ideal is, as Friedman said, the data first.
lo ideal es, como decía Friedman, primero los datos.
And
Y
in
en
that
ese
sense,
sentido,
before that nefarious
antes de
institution called the
que se
Central Bank of
creara
the Argentine Republic
esa
was
nefasta
created,
institución
in the year
llamada Banco Central de la República
1935,
Argentina
the previous 50
en el
years,
año
Argentina had an
1935,
inflation of
los 50 años
0.9% per year.
previos, Argentina tenía una inflación del 0,9% anual.
Then,
Después,
in one of the great pillages of Argentine
en
history, in one of the most
en uno de
colossal
los
scams that
grandes
have been
saqueos de la
made,
historia
in
argentina,
1935, the central bank
en una
was
de las
created,
estafas
a
más
mixed central
colosales
bank,
que se han
and in the
hecho,
first decade of the central bank's life. That is,
en
between
1935
1935
se
and
crea el Banco
1945,
Central,
the
un
inflation
banco
rate
central
jumped to
mixto,
6%.
y en la primera década de vida del Banco Central, es decir, entre 1935 y 1945, la tasa de inflación saltó al 6%.
A
Una
rate
tasa
that
que
probably today
probablemente
in
hoy en
Argentina
Argentina
could even be celebrated, but
se
for what
podría
were the
hasta
standards of the
llegar a
time,
festejar,
was a very, very
pero
high
para lo que eran
inflation.
los estándares de la época era una inflación muy, muy alta.
But
Pero
since
como
that
eso
was
no nos
not enough for
alcanzaba
us,
con esto de
with
tener
this
un
having
Banco
a mixed central
Central
bank, in the year
en el año
1946,
1946 el
the
Banco
central
Central se
bank was
nacionalizó
nationalized and firm there
y a
until
partir de ahí hasta
1991. The
1991
average
la
inflation of
inflación promedio de
Argentina
la
was
Argentina fue
240%.
240%.
In
En
that interval, we
ese
had two
intervalo
hyperinflations, even without having a
tuvimos
war, and we took
2
13 zeros
hiperinflaciones
off the
aún sin tener
currency.
una guerra
And the widespread repudiation
y
of
le
the
quitamos
currency
13 ceros a
led
la
to what was
moneda
the most successful
y el
stabilization
repudio
program in
generalizado
Argentine
de la
history,
moneda
which was convertibility.
llevó a lo que fue el programa de estabilización más exitoso de la historia argentina, que fue la convertibilidad. Si
Although
bien
between the
entre
year
el año
1991 and
1991 y 2001
2001,
la
the
inflación
average
promedio fue
inflation
de
was 9%,
9%,
it is true
es
that that
cierto
level
que
of
ese
inflation was
nivel
concentrated
de
between the
inflación se
years
concentró entre los
1991
años
and
1991 y
1992, and from
1992, y a
1993 to
partir de
2001,
1993
Argentina was
hasta el
among the
2001,
countries with the
Argentina
least
estuvo entre los
inflation in the
países con
world.
menos inflación del mundo.
Then,
Después,
when the state ran out of funding and fell into
cuando
default, instead
el
of trying
Estado
to
se
put
quedó
the
sin
accounts in order,
financiamiento
they decided to scam us
y
again.
cayó en default, en lugar de tratar de poner las cuentas en orden, decidieron estafarnos nuevamente.
In
De
fact,
hecho,
if you look at the banknotes
si
we had
ustedes
at
se
that
fijan en
time,
los billetes
it
que
said legal
teníamos en
tender
aquella
convertibles.
época,
And
decía
today they are
convertibles
no
de
longer
curso
legal
legal.
tender, it does not have
y hoy
that
ya
slogan.
no lo son, no tiene esa consigna. Es
That
decir,
is, therefore,
por lo
they do not
tanto,
have the backing that those banknotes
no
had.
tienen el respaldo que aquellos billetes tenían, es decir,
The
la
political
casta
caste
política
scammed
nos
us
volvió a
again,
estafar,
but they told us that this
pero ellos
time or this
dijeron
time
que
it's going to be
esa
different, and
vez
it wasn't
o
different
esta
at
vez
all.
va a ser diferente, y no fue diferente en nada.
I'm
Yo voy
going
a
to round up
redondear
the
los
numbers.
números.
Warning,
Aviso
because
porque
then they are
después
going
van a
to start
empezar
with the number
porque
that
el
comma,
número que
I don't know
bajó,
what
no sé
thing.
qué cosa. Entonces,
I've been
aviso
warning you
ya
already
desde
that I'm
antes,
going to
los
round them
voy a
up.
redondear.
If I
Si
take the
tomo
average
la
inflation of the
inflación
first period of the
promedio
Kirchner regime, say, with
del
N-store
primer
Kirchner at the head,
periodo del
the average
régimen
inflation was
kirchnerista,
10%.
digamos, con Néstor Kirchner a la cabeza, la inflación promedio fue del 10%.
In the
En el
second
segundo
period of the
periodo
Kirchner
del régimen
regime,
kirchnerista,
that
es
is,
decir, en
in
la
the
primera
first presidency
presidencia
of Cristina
de Cristina
Fernández de
Fernández de
Kirchner,
Kirchner, la
inflation
inflación la
jumped
hizo
to
saltar al
20% on
20%
average.
en promedio.
In the third period
En
of the
el
Kirchnerist
tercer
regime,
periodo
that is,
del
the
régimen
second
kirchnerista,
presidency
o la
of
segunda
Cristina Fernández
presidencia
de Kirchner,
de Cristina
average
Fernández de Kirchner, la
inflation
inflación
rose to
promedio trepó al
30%.
30%.
Perhaps in
Quizás
the
en
document he
el
published,
documento que
he forgot to
publicó
say that perhaps one of his ways to
se
combat inflation
olvidó
was to lie to
de
it.
decir que quizás una de sus formas de combatir la inflación era mentirla. Es decir,
It
a
does not
nosotros no nos
seem to
parece
us that
que
the
la
formula is to
fórmula es
break the
romper el
thermometer.
termómetro.
In other
Es
words,
decir, la
the
fórmula es
formula
medir
is
las
to measure
cosas.
things.
O
Or, when
cuando
so many
se
are
espantan
frightened by the
tantos por
poor,
los pobres,
firm
o
where
la pobreza,
poverty,
tanto
both getting to
llegar a la
poverty
pobreza como
and
salir a
getting
la
out of
pobreza no es
poverty,
algo que se
is
genere
not something
de
that
manera
is generated
instantánea.
instantly. It demands
Demanda
time,
tiempo,
it
demanda
demands
crecimiento
genuine
económico
economic
genuino.
growth, if it does not
Si no es que
appear from one
aparece de un
day to
día
the
para el
next
otro
just
porque
because.
sí,
It
o
disappears from
desaparece
one
de un
day
día
to the
para el otro
next
porque
just
sí.
because. And
Y
among
entre
other
otras
things,
cosas,
because they
como
were
les
annoyed by the poverty
molestaba
rate,
el
they
índice de
considered it a
pobreza,
stigmatizing measure, and decided
consideraron
not
que
to
era una medida
publish it anymore.
estigmatizante y decidieron no publicarlo más.
I
Es
mean,
decir,
that
así,
way,
claro,
of
así es
course, that's
fácil,
easy.
digamos,
Drawing
dibujar los
numbers
números
should
debe
make it
ser
much
muchísimo
easier
más
to
fácil
achieve
conseguir
achievements
logros
and
y
better show
mostrar
the
mejor
performance of a government.
la performance de un gobierno.
Well,
Bueno, no es
it's
la
not the
forma
way
que
we've
nosotros
decided to
hemos
take
decidido
it.
tomar.
We have
Nosotros hemos
decided to tell
decidido
the truth because
decir la
we
verdad,
prefer
porque
to
nosotros
tell an
preferimos
inconvenient truth rather than a
decir
comfortable lie.
una verdad incómoda antes que una mentira confortable.
So
Así es
let's
que
say,
vimos,
at least,
por
ladies,
lo
if you
menos,
want to
señora,
make
si quiere hacer
criticisms,
críticas,
start by
empiece
making
a
a
hacer una
self-criticism
autocrítica que le
that
está
is
costando
costing the
bastante
country
caro
quite
al
dearly,
país,
which is
es
for
por
having
haber
lied
mentido
about the
los
numbers,
números.
or the disasters they
Todos
made,
los
for
desastres
example,
que
with the
hicieron,
IPF
por
case,
ejemplo, con el
which
caso
is
de
also
YPF,
going to cost all
que también nos va a
Argentines
costar
dearly.
carísimo a todos los argentinos.
But
Pero
not only
no
that,
solo eso,
later, during the
después,
Macri period,
durante el
average
periodo de
inflation
Macri,
ended up
la
climbing
inflación
to
promedio
average
terminó
levels of
trepando a niveles
40%.
promedio del 40%,
So
con
it
lo
is
cual
not
no
a
es
matter of which
un tema
inflation
de
appeared
que
now.
apareció ahora la inflación.
Yes.
¿Sí? Es
Moreover,
más,
Mr. Alberto
el señor
Fernández,
Alberto
the thumping
Fernández,
autocrat,
el
basically left
autócrata
with an inflation
golpeador,
of 210%.
¿sí?
But that does not reflect the dynamics that he had left because, let's
Básicamente,
say, as his government was advancing,
se fue con una inflación
inflation
del
was advancing, and I
210%.
remember when we had
Pero
already
eso
won the
tampoco
elections,
refleja la
and we were
dinámica
making and
que
finalizing
había
details to
dejado,
get
porque
to the
digamos,
function.
conforme iba avanzando su gobierno, la inflación iba avanzando. Y yo recuerdo cuando nosotros ya habíamos ganado las elecciones y estábamos haciendo y ultimando detalles para llegar a la función.
During the
Durante
first
la
week of
primera
December,
semana de
prices were
diciembre, los
growing at a
precios
daily rate
crecían
of 1%,
a un
that
ritmo
put in
diario del
annual terms.
1%. Eso puesto en términos anuales. Lo
The good
bueno es
thing
que a
is that
ustedes
I
no les
don't
tengo que
have to
explicar cómo
explain to you
funciona
how a
una función
function
de
of
tipo
geometric
geométrica.
type works. That
Es decir,
is,
ustedes
you
saben
know how to
computar
compute
exponenciales.
exponentials, and that
Y
annualized
eso
gives
anualizado da
3,700%.
3.700%. Sin
However, in the
embargo,
first 15 days of
en los
December,
primeros
that is
15
to
días
say
de
that during the
diciembre,
second week of December,
es decir, o sea que
there was
durante
a
la segunda
stronger
semana de
acceleration.
diciembre
The
hubo una
average
aceleración más
inflation
fuerte.
happens to be at
La inflación promedio
1.2%
pasa
per
a
day.
estar en el 1,2% diario. Eso
That
es
is to
decir
say that the reality,
que
inflation had been
la
traveling at
realidad, la inflación venía viajando al
7,500% per year.
7.500% anual.
And when
Y
you were
cuando ustedes
calculating the
computaban
different
los
imbalances
distintos
that the
desequilibrios
Argentine
que tenía la
economy
economía
had on the
argentina en el
monetary
plano
level, that
monetario,
is, Because let's remember that we were facing what was going to be the worst crisis in Argentine economic history. Because it combined a monetary surplus that was twice what we had in the previous one, the Rodrigazo, an experiment that involved the six-fold increase in the inflation rate. Not only that, we also had an absolutely bankrupt central bank. He was in an even worse situation, let's say, than the one Alfonsina had at the beginning of the 89th year, which ended with a hyper of 5,000% in wholesalers. In addition, we had worse social indicators than those that were in the 2001. Therefore, everything was set for a disaster. In addition, we had the equivalent of 4 monetary bases inside the central bank, but in remunerated liabilities that generated endogenous money creation, we had 90,000. Millions of dollars maturing in pesos, that is, let's say, in pesos equivalent to 90,000. Millions of dollars. We had maturities of foreign debt for 25,000. Millions of dollars, where most of it was with the International Monetary Fund. But the program was down because the previous government had not fulfilled anything. Therefore, inflation, let's say, is not generated by us. It was generated by these 20-odd years of wild populism. And the reality is that we describe the heritage, but we do not complain about the heritage because we are also going to be honest. Under normal conditions of pressure and temperature, a libertarian liberal does not win the presidency. Therefore, let's say, that is, we are clear that the conditions under which we were going to arrive were going to be about something on the verge of total collapse. In that sense, it was fundamental for us. Besides, my job description has 2 things, and it is very clear, which is on the one hand the demand to end the insecurity, where that wonderful minister that I have was today morning is Dr. Bullrich, who is giving battle and who, for example, has achieved the first month, if not homicide, in Rosario. And the truth is that he is doing a truly exceptional job. So that part of the job description comes barbaric. And the other part of the job description says that we have to eradicate inflation. Then, as I was telling you, inflation in wholesalers was traveling at 54% per month, that is, at 17,000% per year, and that was feasible, because what you needed was to validate the fiscal deficit, quasi-fiscal validation. I say it was due. The passes were due by 1 day. Let's say, there was the problem of the puts, there was the problem of the debt in weight, therefore. There was everything for that to be validated, plus the monetary surplus. And if you take the latest data on wholesale inflation, it is around 3%. And if you to that 3% that he has annualized is something like a little over 20%. If you take away what we call induced inflation, which has to do with the pec crawling of 2%, and international inflation, that gives about 2.5%, and there is an inflation that annualized is 6%, with which we are also fulfilling this part of job description, despite the fact that Paddle N, and that some, let's say, who screwed up so much, resist to recognize it. So, beyond this, the point is how we got here, and now I'm going to make a little introduction of monetary theory, that I hope Chris takes note of.
Ahora, digamos, voy a hacer una pequeña introducción de teoría monetaria que espero que Chris toma nota.
Take out the notebook and the pencil and write down that what you have next to you are not going to help you at all, because they are the ones that generate this disaster. Basically, in order to have a diagnosis, You have to have a good theoretical framework. You have to understand what you are talking about. Because if you don't understand what you are talking about, betting on the type 2 error is not something that works recurrently. The type 1 mistake is to do everything right and have it go wrong. The type 2 mistake is to do everything wrong and get it right. And it is clear that the theory won by scandal over the caste, let's say, in the matter of inflation being a monetary phenomenon. Now, to understand the nature of what inflation is. Inflation is the loss of the purchasing power of money. That is, it is a clearly different definition, that is to the generalized rise in prices. Because if for you inflation is the loss of the purchasing power of money, it means that there is a problem of excess money supply, and the problem is in the central bank. If you think that in the generalized price increase, you are going to blame the price formers, that is, then you are going to do price controls. It is a tool that for 4,000 years we have had evidence that it does not work. So, okay, then we have to understand the nature of money, because clearly, I apologize for having to explain this, but clearly the obvious must be explained. If the colossus who is here, who is Federico Sturzenegger, and what you had to deal with caste, will know. Look, I believed that before believing that the central bank had to be eliminated, I believed that there could be a central bank, and especially when undoubtedly one of the most talented economists in the world was in charge of the central bank, with a truly exceptional group. After what I saw they did to him, I lost all hope, let's say, and decided that the best thing that can happen is no central bank. But I'm going to explain that now too. In that sense, what one would have to explain is where the existence of money comes from. So what is the economy like when you have no money? Well, it's the barter economy. That is, goods are exchanged for goods. Now, if you have a barter economy, you basically have two problems. One is the problem of double coincidence. That is, you have to find someone who wants the good that you have to sell, but at the same time, that person has to want the good that you have. Which, obviously, that poses a huge problem that causes a lot of transactions to be lost. With which there is a huge problem. And the other problem is that of indivisibility, because maybe I want to eat bread, and the baker on the corner wants an economics talk. But the problem is to say how much kilo of bread. Obviously the ones that, let's say, before I became president, were a few kilos that I couldn't eat. So, that raises a problem of indivisibility. That is, because, let's say, perhaps for what he would give for a kilo of conference bread does not serve him anything. Now, the thing is that the human being, faced with that situation, did not start crying. That is, and I didn't want to call Dad state either. He hasn't bothered either. What did he do? He found the way around, solved it, looked for the way around, and fixed it somehow. And one of the things that human beings discovered, that there were goods that were exchanged more than others. Then they began to buy those goods that were exchanged much more, and use them as an indirect exchange mechanism. Then suddenly they would buy that good, and with that good they would then buy the one they wanted. That is, and that is where the money comes in. That is, the indirect exchange good is a good that is used to make transactions. That's the money. Then, faced with this situation, different types of exchange and direct goods appeared throughout history and functioned as money. The first one was the cattle. And why was it the cattle? Because man was a nomad, and then he traveled with his own food, that is, with cattle. Then it was something that they exchanged regularly, and then they used it as an indirect exchange good, and then the money was the cattle. Now later, man became sedentary, and when he became sedentary, one of the things he ate most deeply, so to speak, was bread.
Una de las cosas que comía con mayor profundidad, por decirlo de alguna manera, era el pan.
Then they noticed that a lot of transactions were being made in wheat. Then, after that, wheat became currency. So we have different types of currencies. We have, for example, flax or coffee, tobacco. Moreover, there is a very funny quote by Milton Friedman that talks about hyperinflation in Germany. And they say that nails were used as money or whiskey was also used. No, sorry, the cognac. So, he said it was the most liquid definition of money he had ever encountered in his life. Moreover, if you look at the films of many years of prisons, what was the money? The cigarettes. I mean, what were the prisoners asking for? They were asking for cigarettes, but they suddenly started smoking. No, they were used to exchange them inside the prison. Now, what is the problem with this kind of good that does not serve as a store of value? That is, what happened with this type of goods is that they were degraded. So, it's like having. Chris notes that another lesson is happening to you. It's like having a negative interest rate. It's like ice cream. You guys have an ice cream. As time goes by, it's worth less. That's a negative interest rate. And, in fact, what you have to understand, you cannot tell the price of money, ma'am, because the interest rate exists regardless of whether money exists. There is an interest rate because there is time. The interest rate has to do with the mechanism of passing consumption over time. That is, saving, which is future consumption, is a way of spending consumption over time. So, those who get into debt are those who advance consumption, and those who lose are those who defer consumption. And that is even independent of the existence of the central bank. That, let's say, what the interest rate has to do with the relative price of present goods relative to future goods. It has nothing to do with the monetary issue. It exists because time exists. If not, let's say, it did not open interest rate. It would be a spawn that has no explanation, like the one Keynes did in the general theory. Mistake that we dragged for a long time. But then, to try to preserve the value, then they switched to metallic coins, and that's how gold, silver, and bronze appeared. Gold was used for large transactions, silver was used for smaller transactions. Probably the most well-known silver coin was the workshop, which is the dollar today. And in that sense, there was also another problem, that was the problem of portability. So, there I made the example of the fox, so that the problem could be seen graphically. Then, they started with the story of Zorro, the version of I don't know what. What do I know? I talked about the version I watched on TV of the Williams. What do I know? The other versions, why? So, what I said is that, strictly speaking, let's say, I love that version of Zorro because he's a real anarcho-capitalist, right? Because the fox, what was he doing? He fought with the evildoers who robbed the merchants and fought against the soldiers. This is very interesting, because this is what surprises me, because instead of capturing the abstraction, they stay in the small print. Well, that's why we are the way we are. Or maybe he was hurt by so much tincture. The thought darkened him. That said, which one is it? But Cristina wasn't talking. That said, what was the big deal?
¿Qué era lo que pasaba?
If you were going to market, what would you go with?
¿Con qué iban a ir?
Either
Ya
with
sea
goods
con
or
bienes
with gold.
o con oro.
So it's like you guys had a sign
Entonces
on
es
your
como que ustedes
forehead
llevaban un
that said, I have
cartel
gold.
en la frente
He was
que decía,
coming to
"Tengo
rob me.
oro,
He
venía
was
a
coming to
robarme,
rob
venía a
me."
robarme".
And
¿Y
what
qué
were the
hacían
criminals
los
doing?
delincuentes?
They were
Iban a
going and
tratar
going
de
to try to
interceptar esas
intercept those
carretas,
carts, because it was a
porque era
penalty
penal
without a
sin arquero,
goalkeeper.
ahí había
There was
oro.
gold there. And in that
Y
sense, what is interesting?
en ese sentido, ¿qué es lo interesante?
That the
Que el
fox
zorro
was
luchaba
fighting these
contra esos
criminals.
delincuentes. ¿Por
Why?
qué?
Because
Porque
if they did
si
not
no
arrive in the city
llegaban
with the goods,
a
then
la
they had a
ciudad con
capital
los
loss.
bienes,
They ate the effect of the gold coins
entonces
at that time.
tenían una
They
pérdida
were
de
going to be
capital,
eaten
se
with a
comían
higher price
el
level
efecto de las
expressed
monedas
in
de oro en ese
gold,
momento,
and in that
se lo iban
sense.
a comer con
What was
mayor
going to
nivel de
happen is that
precios,
no one
prisa
was
del
going
oro,
to bring them goods
y en
again,
ese
and then it
sentido,
is as if
lo
they
que
had
iba a
closed the
pasar
economy, with which they
es
would
que
have had a
nadie iba a
huge
volver
loss
a
of
traer los
well-being.
bienes y entonces es como si hubieran cerrado la economía, con lo cual hubieran tenido una pérdida enorme de bienestar.
Then the
Entonces el
fox was
zorro además
also
era
a
un
social
benefactor social
benefactor,
porque como
because as he protected
protegía,
the
digamos,
roads so that thieves did not steal from
digamos,
merchants.
los caminos
Then
para
he
que
was
los ladrones
also
no
a
robaran
supporter
a los
of free trade.
comerciantes. Entonces, además era partidario del libre comercio,
Very liberal.
bien
But on
liberal,
top of that,
pero
there
encima
was
se
a fight
peleaba
against
contra
the monastery
monasterio y
and
demás,
so
con lo
on,
cual se
with
peleaba
which
contra
there
la
was a fight
autoridad,
against the
se
authority.
peleaba, digamos,
There
contra el
was a
tema de
fight
los pagos
against
de
the issue
impuestos,
of
por lo
tax
tanto, o
payments.
sea,
Therefore, I
el
mean,
zorro
its
era
Zorro were
anarcocapitalista, eso no
narco-capitalists,
tengan
have no
dudas.
doubts. I mean,
Digo,
it could
también podría
also
ser
be
anarcocapitalista,
anarcho-capitalist,
estar
to
al
be at
frente
the
del
head of
Estado
the
y ser
state
como el topo
and
de
be like
Estado
the
que viene a
state mole,
romperlo.
who
¿O
comes to
acaso
break
qué
it.
creen que es
Or
el rasgo del
perhaps what
gasto
do you
público
think
el
it is to have
30%?
reduced public spending by 30%? Only
Solo
after the
después de la
war,
guerra
and there are no
y
such
no hay
great experiences.
experiencias tan grandes.
Having
Dicho
said that,
esto,
then it appeared that the
entonces
paper
apareció
money.
que el dinero papel.
Then you
Entonces
would leave
ustedes
the metal,
dejaban
leave it in a place,
el
and give him
metálico,
a certificate
lo
in
dejaban en un
return.
lugar y le daban a cambio un certificado.
Then
Entonces
you would
ustedes
go
después
and
iban
pay with that
y
certificate.
pagaban con ese certificado.
Obviously,
Obviamente que
there
no
was no
faltó
lack of the
se
one
hizo el
who made the
piola y emitió
piola and
certificado sin
issued
que
a
estuviera el
certificate
oro, la
without the
plata
gold,
o
silver being behind.
atrás.
Well,
Bueno,
obviously, he
obviamente
ended up with a
terminó con un
couple
par
of
de
revolts,
revueltas, pero
but
el
the state
Estado
he
que
made.
hizo
He said
dijo, no,
no,
bueno, ahora lo
well,
voy a
I'm
hacer
going
yo.
to do it now.
Y ahí
And
es
that's
donde
where
nos
they screwed
arruinaron
up
la
our
moneda.
currency. So,
Entonces,
and that's where the problems of
y ahí es
society
donde
begin,
empiezan
and
los
central
problemas de la
banks are a
sociedad
relatively
y
new
los bancos
invention.
centrales son un invento relativamente nuevo.
But
Pero
here's
acá
the
lo
important
importante,
thing, back to you
de
now.
vuelta, ahora le pasamos su
Sabre
gracia
here,
acá,
ma'am.
señora.
Money
El
is an
dinero es un bien
indirect
de
exchange
intercambio
good.
indirecto.
That
Digo,
the
que el
course of
devenir
history
de la
has turned it
historia lo
into a
haya
paper
convertido en
that
un
is
papel que es
falsified by the world's
falsificado por
central
los bancos
banks,
centrales del
that is
mundo,
another
ese es
problem.
otro problema.
That is
Esa
the
es la
great
gran
scams in the
estafa de la
history of
historia de la
mankind
humanidad que se
that is
llama Banco
called the
Central.
central bank.
Pero
But
el
money is
el
an
dinero
indirect
es un bien
exchange
de
good.
intercambio indirecto.
And
¿Y
why
por
is
qué
it
es
so
tan
important to
importante
emphasize that
enfatizar
it
que
is an
es
indirect exchange good?
un bien de intercambio indirecto?
Because
Porque si
if
es un
it is
bien
an
de
indirect
intercambio
exchange
indirecto,
good,
quiere decir
it
que es
means that
una
it is a
demanda
derived demand.
derivada.
I
Es
mean,
decir,
let's
a
see,
ver,
guys,
muchachos,
which one of you is
¿quién de
thinking
ustedes
about
está
hoarding which
pensando en
coin to take
acumular
to the wooden suit?
qué moneda para llevársela, digamos, al traje de madera?
It would have to
Digo,
be
habría que
quite
ser
silly.
bastante tonto. Digo,
On
de
the
otro
other
lado,
side, he doesn't buy
no
buy
compra nada.
anything.
Digo,
God
solamente
only
compra
buys here,
en
in
la
fiction,
ficción que
which
es
is the visualization
la,
that one
la
makes or
visualización
someone
que uno
once
hace.
got to
O
thinking.
alguno alguna vez se
That the
puso a
amount of
pensar
ink, say, on the
que
$1,
la cantidad de
$2,
tinta,
$5,
digamos, en el billete de
$10,
$1,
$20,
de
$50,
de
and
5, de 10,
$100
de
bill is the
20,
same.
de 50 y de 100 es la misma.
The
Lo
only
único
thing
que
that
cambian
changes
son los
are the
dibujitos,
drawings, that
o
is,
sea, los
the
próceres
characters and the numbers.
y los números.
But there
Pero
you are
ahí
making a
ustedes
mental
están
representation of that.
haciendo una representación mental de eso.
So what
Entonces,
we
lo que hay
have
que
to understand
entender
is that at bottom, the
es que en el
demand for
fondo,
money
la
is a
demanda de dinero
derivative
es una
demand
demanda
for
de
money.
dinero.
Why are they
Para,
demanding
¿para
money
qué demandan
for?
dinero? Para
To
demandar
demand
bienes.
goods. They
No
don't eat
tomen
money.
dinero, no se
They
lo
don't
tomen,
eat
no,
it.
no, digamos, o
No,
sea,
I mean,
no,
don't
traten
take
de
out a bill
saquen el
now.
billete
I
ahora,
mean,
digo,
try
traten
to
de
eat it.
comérselo, para
You'll
no,
see,
no
it
no
doesn't work.
funciona. Es más,
In fact,
probablemente les
they
caiga mal.
probably don't like me. So
Entonces,
basically, the
en el
demand for
fondo,
money is a
la demanda de
derivative
dinero es una
demand.
demanda
It is a
derivada,
mirror demand
es
of the
una
demand
demanda
for goods.
espejo de la demanda de bienes.
And this is interesting because if it is a mirror of the demand for goods, all the macroeconomics books that put that the demand for money as a function of income and the interest rate is a horror. In reality, the demand for money depends on consumption, and obviously it depends on the intertemporal path of consumption. And if I want to take out, let's say, in the fund on which it is depending, why don't I need to put the income? Because if I am building a general equilibrium system, my income comes out of the sale of leisure in the labor market and comes out of the participation I have in the profits of companies. Therefore, I don't have to put in the income. That's an aberration. That's a stupid thing Keynes did to be able to invent the effect of adjusting quantities, and above all things, to invent the Keynesian multiplier, which is to violate the budget constraint. Of course, by violating the budget restriction, of course, let's say, if you finance it with monetary emission, it generates inflation, ma'am. If it generates inflation, if you finance the fiscal deficit with monetary issuance, it generates inflation. And in other countries that have deficits, they finance it with remunerated debt, that is, not that of the central bank. Now, then it means that if my money demand function now depends on my intertemporal path of consumption, I have to know what the consumption demand comes from. When you pose an exercise, are you going to take a micro book, and when you look at the general equilibrium excess demand functions, or the demand functions of a good, what does it depend on? Of all the prices in the economy. If the income does not appear, all the prices of the economy appear. And, at the same time, if that economy is intertemporal, it includes today's prices, tomorrow's prices, and so on. There is no need to set the interest rate. The interest rate is implicit in the part of the price vector that contains the future prices. Therefore, let's say, the demand for money depends on consumption. And this is very interesting because then, what does the demand for money ultimately depend on? That depends on consumption, that depends on their prices. All of that stems from where? Of what Robert Lucas Jr., may he rest in peace, he said, the deep parameters. And the deep parameters that are the utility function, that is, preferences, technology, endowments, and the type of economy I have, if it is a privately owned economy, but therefore, all those parameters are given. Therefore, under normal conditions, without someone shaking up the economy by issuing money like a pig, the path of consumption would be determined by these parameters that are deep parameters and that are given. Therefore, the classics were not so stupid when they believed that the demand for money was something granitic. Yes, of course, under normal conditions of pressure and temperature, it is somewhat granitic. That is, if preferences do not change, technology does not change, endowments do not change. And that vector of intertemporal consumption does not change. Therefore, if the demand for money is a granitic structure, the real demand for money, that has to equal to what? To the real money supply. You saw that Muhammad Ali or Cassius Clay, whatever you want to call him, was calling the photographers and telling him, get ready that the knockout is coming. Take the photos because another knockout is coming for Mrs. Cristina Fernández de Kirchner. If the demand for money is a granitic structure, this is what we have, which is the real demand for money. This has to equal the real balances. Real balances are the nominal amount of money above the price level. Therefore, the price level will be given by the amount of money offered by the central bank on the demand for money, which is this real demand for money. Therefore, when the central bank issues money, all it does is change the nominal scale, that is, prices rise. Note, madam, inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon generated by an excess supply of money, either because money is issued or because the demand for money falls, or both things happen. In fact, I'm going to tell you more. If he was able to get up and count to 8, come on, I'll give him back. In this context, when you have this situation, a loss of the purchasing power of money is generated.
esta situación se genera una pérdida del poder adquisitivo del dinero.
This means that all prices expressed in monetary units go up and the dollar is one more price of the economy. What happens, to note another one, there is something called High-Cantillon effect that has to see which are the prices that rise first, and which are those that come behind. So, for example, if you had a situation of a drop in the demand for money, that situation, okay. You don't demand domestic money, what are you going to demand? Well, in principle, they go and demand dollars, that is, they make a change of portfolio. Then, the price of the dollar jumps. Why? Because it is a financial asset, it adjusts quickly. Now, once that happened, the price of the tradable goes up. After that, the price of the wholesalers goes up, then the retailers, and finally the salary. That's why, let's say, when you have an event of these characteristics, it destroys the workers. In other words, it creates a tremendous problem. It has to do with a case of falling demand for money. That is, it is not that the dollar causes prices to rise. No, it is an early indicator in such a scenario. And besides, it can't always do that because in reality, what may have happened is that you increase the supply of money. Then you feed the demand for goods, then the price of, let's say, retail prices goes up. Since that puts pressure on wholesalers, then it puts pressure on wages, and since they don't give them the numbers afterwards. If it's not competitive, the exchange rate jumps. They realize that it all depends on where the oversupply was generated. Madam, it's a nonsense, that is to say that the exchange rate is the one that determines the rest of the prices. But I'll explain it more later anyway. Therefore, we, working with general equilibrium seriously, not like those econochanta who say that they do general equilibrium, and cannot solve a Lagrangian. So, I mean, in fewer intertemporal cases, our diagnosis was and is and will continue to be that inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon generated by an excess of supply, either because supply rises, or because demand falls, or both things happen at the same time. Therefore, faced with the disastrous scenario, we had that we were going to an inflation of 17,000%, with which the fall in GDP would have been monstrous, with which the number of poor would also have been monstrous. We would have been more than 90% poor and more than 50% destitute. That is, we would have replicated the case of Venezuela, without a doubt. Then our first fundamental idea was to end inflation. Attack inflation. I noticed that during the campaign I said that monetary policy also has a lag of 18 to 24 months. I mean, because it looks like he was speaking, I don't know, in Sanskrit. So they're all in a hurry, and they've only been 9 months. Go and see my files, not the edited ones, see the whole thing, not the ones that the dirty ones of the journalists in excess. Not all of them, a large part, let's say, they edit to distort the information and to lie. Then go and watch the original videos, they are. So the issue was to curb monetary issuance. How did we stop the monetary issue? So, one of the sources of emission that there was the financing of the fiscal deficit. When we arrived at the consolidated fiscal deficit between the Treasury and the National Treasury, there were 15 points of GDP, where 5 were in the Treasury and 10 in the central bank. Therefore, the task that the central bank and the Ministry of Financing had in front of them, and I have the honor of having Pablo Kirchner's giant and Vladimir Werning here. Let's say that they have been great architects of fixing this problem. These two sources of money creation had to be attacked. So, what we proposed was the zero deficit. I remember that during the campaign I was going with a chainsaw, and they told me that I was crazy because I was going with a chainsaw. In fact, we had dropped the agreement with the International Monetary Fund, which made it an enormous difficulty to resolve the fallen agreement. And in that context, we decided to go to the bottom and show a zero deficit plan. The fund was enough for us to meet the goals of the previous government, where, madam, you will criticize that government, but you were also a part. So, in that sense, we had proposed the zero deficit. Obviously, just as during the campaign, they said that it was impossible, that we were delusional, and I don't know how many other things. The fund with which we fulfilled the program that was down due to the disaster of the previous government, with that I reached it. We proposed the zero deficit. It seemed like a very ambitious thing because it involved a 5-point adjustment of GDP in the Treasury. And despite the fact that in the last 123 years of history, during 113, we had fiscal deficits. Only in 10 that we didn't have it we were in default. It was the first time in these last 123 years that we reached the zero deficit. But we didn't. It wasn't in a year. We achieved this in the first month of management. Yes, that's management. Obviously, all those who said that it was impossible to do this, those who have failed recurrently throughout history, and who should be called to silence because they are part of the damage and destruction caused by the Argentines, should have a little more humility or at least self-criticism. So what happened? We ended up making an adjustment of public spending of more than 30%. Then they started saying it was because we didn't pay, because we drew the numbers or whatever they said. The same things the lady says here. It's far and late with those comments. Already those comments were being made in January, in February, in March. Let's say, today no one raises those arguments anymore. Let's say that they belittle the task that we have done, and clearly today. It is clearly understood that this is a monetary policy rule that has come to stay. And that soon I will go to Congress to present the budget based on the law, let's say, of zero deficit. And that meant that we stopped broadcasting to finance the Treasury. Now, the quasi-fiscal, let's say, was generated endogenously, which had to do with the remuneration of the remunerated liabilities of the central bank, and which generated 10 points of fiscal deficit, quasi-fiscal. And in that sense, we had to finish with the endogenous emission, and according to showing the positive fiscal result, and accumulating financial surpluses, this giant that is here, Mr. Pablo Curno, could start to recompose the curve in pesos. Este gigante que está acá, el señor Pablo Kirchner, pudo empezar a recomponer la curva en pesos. And being able to recompose the curve in pesos allowed to take out the debt that was in the central bank and pass it to the Treasury, because at bottom it was always Treasury debt. No, why? What, for example, did Quizerism do? It was issuing money with a fixed exchange rate, it was losing reserves. Madam, you took the country with $52 billion of reserves and destroyed it. How many did Federico deliver him with? 5. Net minus 5,000. A wonder, ma'am. But apart from that, the problem of the future dollar, which was about 25,000 millions of dollars. And in that context, of course, when they are issued with a fixed exchange rate, one of the things that happens, they lose reserves. And what were they doing? They put up bonds to the central bank. They have placed more than $100 billion on the bond to the central bank. A real scam. And that's how they got the dollars out. So that in fact, one of the things that the central bank did recently was to recognize that capital loss that the previous government generated by a whopping, for example, $45 billion. Not only that, but when we started doing this, no one believed we could fix the quasi-fiscal problem. Moreover, madam, you at one point complain that the real interest rate is negative. I tell him that if we had listened to the econocentrists that proposed to put the real interest rate in positive terms, let's say, instead of having 4 paid bases with respect to the existing one, today we would have 8, 9, 10. The carry trade. Today, the carry trade would be a discussion, and we would clearly be on the verge of hyperinflation. But we did something else. I tell him to send the brutes next to him to study because, do you know what we did? We arbitrated the dollar rate with the peso rate, corrected for risk, obviously, and that made quota. Then the devaluation. The devaluation, ma'am, was done. That is, just because you sweep the data under the rug does not mean that the devaluation was. The relationship between the parallel dollar and say if the officer was about 3-to-1. In fact, when we assumed the parallel was around 1,300, and today it was 1,240. How the baboons suffer from it. It doesn't matter, there is a flourishing business called the production of Vaseline for serial cheating economists. So, and that nobody said how to fix, or that it was impossible, or that they were proposing expropriations. We and these 2 giants who are here, Pablo and Vladimir, have made the quasi-prosecutor did it 0. What seemed impossible, we did in 7 months. That is, in 1 month, we achieved the miracle of the 0 deficit, and in 7 months, we achieved the miracle of ending the quasi-fiscal. There is management, gentlemen. However, it was not the only bomb that the previous government had left us. The problem had also left us, the puts bomb, something that the previous government was running a fiscal deficit. And the International Monetary Fund decided to turn a blind eye to. And since the banks did not want to finance the treasury, they preferred to do it with the central bank, the puts appeared. But of course, accounting puts only goes for the contingent, not for the contingency. But of course, in a scenario of macroeconomic debacle that was in the money. And, obviously, when we announced the part of the monetary program, that is 0 excess demand, that is, it was stopped issuing for the Treasury, it was stopped issuing for remunerated liabilities. And we were going to go to a phase in which it was only issued by external sector. And we were sitting at the table with the banks discussing the issue of puts, let's say. The macro bank went and executed the equivalent of 2,000 for us.
Y estábamos sentados en la mesa con los bancos discutiendo el tema de los puts. Digamos, el banco macro fue y nos ejecutó el equivalente
millions of dollars.
de dólares.
I mean, I want to know how many times in his life you saw that Argentina attacked him for the equivalent of 2,000 millions of dollars in one day, and the economy held up. Another miracle. That is, there is more force to heaven than we think. In that sense, we were also able to take forward the issue of puts, and faced with the possibility of another run situation. and macro instability, with Minister Caputo, who will be remembered in textbooks with the best minister of economy in history. We also decided at a conference with Santiago Bausili to move to a deeper stage of monetary policy, that is to move to the zero-emission regime.
Será recordado en los libros de texto como el mejor ministro de Economía de la historia. Decidimos, en conferencia además con Santiago Bausili, pasar a una etapa más profunda de la política monetaria, que es pasar al régimen de emisión cero.
Basically, the problem was that we, following the textbooks, believed that the purchase of dollars was tied to the demand for money. And therefore, let's say, if the demand for money was tied to the supply, that does not generate inflation.
La compra de dólares estaba calzada con demanda de dinero y por ende, digamos, si la demanda de dinero estaba calzada con la oferta, eso no genera inflación.
However, one of the things that was not in the textbooks, and that we discovered, is that, of course, since there are capital controls, that is not necessarily true. What's going on? When you have free capital mobility, and if you want to make transactions in pesos, you go with your dollars and buy the pesos from the central bank. And with those weights, you have a real operation underway. Therefore, in that case, it is demand for money, and therefore, in that case, it does not generate inflation. The problem is that when you have stocks, which we have basically to fix the stock problem that the previous government left us. I mean, ma'am, I didn't stop being a liberal libertarian. The thing is that I am a libertarian liberal, not a libertarian libertarian. So, I also understand the economy as problems of stocks and flows. So, if I had 4 monetary bases a day, if I had 90 maturities in pesos, for the equivalent of 90,000 millions of dollars, if I had $50 billion of debt in the Sierra, and it's like if I didn't disarm that bomb. It didn't end well, it ended pretty badly. That I understand what the previous government wanted, that we act as libertarians, that everyone set themselves on fire. And by January, let's say after the looting of supermarkets and other Peronist liturgy, they could come back and definitively kill any hint of freedom. In that sense, we take economics seriously. In other words, we don't just do textbook economics. So, in fact, what happened in the matter of interest rate is a great triumph that we have had also in the matter of economic theory. Because, what did the econocentrists tell us? That the interest rate had to be raised. If we had raised the interest rate, the central bank balance sheet would have blown it up. Thus, having jumped the exchange rate to a level similar to the parallel exchange rate corrected by the country tax. In that context, what happened? That the interest rate in dollars arbitrated with that of pesos, but that of pesos implied to be negative in real terms. And that also allowed us to liquefy the stock of passes. That's for you to learn, ladies. Let's say, in monetary theory only it's not a matter of looking at flows, stocks are also looked at. And sometimes the problem of stocks is much bigger than one imagines because, in fact, it generated a class deficit. That was twice the fiscal deficit. In that sense, we decided to go then something more radicalized because, what is it that happens? When you have capital control, which we need to have until we finish fixing the stock problems, and until we finish cleaning up the money overhang, and the money overhang is going to disappear when inflation is zero. Macroeconomic is zero. You guys, they have the observed and the induced. The macroeconomic is the one that is in the middle, that is, it is that residue that today in wholesale is 0.5 in 1.5 consumers, and that, let's say, is on its way to disappearing. In that context, what is going on? When you have capital control, exporters are obliged to settle in the mulk. And what's the problem with that? That exporter is not necessarily buying pesos. What we do have clear is that he is selling dollars, and note that when there is a clamp and capital control, wanting to buy pesos is not the same as having to sell dollars. That difference is fundamental because then those dollars were not entering because they wanted pesos. Those dollars are entering because there is a regulation that imposes it. So that generated an expansion of the amount of money beyond demand, and that's why inflation persists. That is why inflation persists. Not because there are indexatory mechanisms, because there is inertia inflation. No, because let's say this happened that more was issued than what was demanded. So to correct this, we move to a deeper phase of the program, which is zero emission. And it is not intervention, because the net intervention level falls, because if I am liquidated $3, so to speak, and I issue for $3, my intervention level is $3. Now if I have a gap, and I return dollars so that the pesos remain constant, I guess with the 30s gap, I have $1 left in the central bank, I return to the market. I'm not intervening, I'm making the amount of money stay constant. Or what other way can you think of? What do they want? To sterilize them and pay interest rate again. Again. Soup again. So, if you notice, the intervention went from 3 to 1. Therefore, in this equilibrium there is less intervention, and it looks much more like a free market equilibrium than an intervention equilibrium. Why? Because when there is no intervention, zero intervention, what would it be like? The variation of the exchange rate is free, the variation of the amount of money is zero, and the variation of reserve is zero. There comes another topic. Let's say that the central bank does not buy dollars, that falls into default. Could it be that we are so rude to say such big barbarities? I understand that the doctor says this because she is not an economist. She's supposed to be a lawyer, but she doesn't show us the title either, but suppose she was a lawyer, let's say. She doesn't seem to know that, it's not part of her training. How do they come up with the delusion that the debt has to be bought? It has to be paid with dollars bought by the central bank in the market. That is to say, what you are saying with that is that you are going to issue pesos to buy dollars. And those dollars are then going to come from the state, the treasury. It is going to handle the dollars. It is going to leave them back to public securities with which they are being swindled back. And it is swindling them with the say oriage itself. If you want a more rudimentary version, easier to understand, although incorrect, the inflationary tax. So, what is it that they are telling me? That I have to annihilate Argentines with inflation to pay off the debt. No, guys. The debt is paid with fiscal excess, not like an imbecile buying dollars in the market by issuing pesos. That's the only thing that causes inflation. So the dollars to pay down the debt are bought with the fiscal surplus, which is what we are doing. And then, I want to go to a question of the discussion of endogenous money, because it is incredible. Let's say the lady says that the exchange rate is the one that determines inflation or prices, or if you want, devaluation determines inflation. Basically, I tell you that this is applying the PP and saying that the domestic price is the international price for the exchange rate. I tell you, madam, that is consistent with the quantitative theory. In fact, you know what? This was done by a man named David Hume, who was later taken by Adam Smith and taken by the classics. Therefore, far from being unable to be contemplated. In fact, if the domestic price level is determined at the monetary level by the money supply divided the real demand for money, and that applies the same in the world, the exchange rate that is given by the local price divided the international price, means that it is given by what are called relative monetary conditions. Let me tell you the story. The local supply divided the international supply, the international demand divided the local demand. So if you, as the conditions of the world are given to us, if the amount of money rises or the demand for money falls, that impacts prices, but it also impacts the exchange rate. That is, he realizes that they don't even have consistency in what he says. Moreover, it is also interesting to discuss that model because in the end, what is what? What are they saying? No, well, the problem with inflation is the lack of dollars. A total jerk. Inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. Of course, they start from this idea that local prices are the exchange rate multiplied by the international one, and that the exchange rate is determined by the excess, let's say, it will be moving with the excess demand for currencies. So, the solution that is to export more, that is, more excess demand for goods, is rare. What is the other solution? Defaulting? Restructure. And those are the solutions they propose to lower inflation. They seem quite comical. Do you know why? Because they also made all of those. And then nothing, they allege to the external restriction, another stupidity the size of a house. How does the external constraint model work? You stimulate demand, it makes GDP grow, that makes imports rise, and if they cannot be financed, then you have a limit to the expansion of GDP by external restriction. Do you know why that happens? Because there is fixed price, let flexible price, the external restriction disappears. The external constraint exists in a fixed price model. If you release the prices, there is no external restriction. And the fixed prices, let's say, fixing the exchange rate with fiscal deficit and issuing, was what caused all the reserves to slip and destroy them. Today Argentina should have, if they had done things reasonably, today Argentina would have to have about 120,000 to 150,000. We have millions of dollars of reserves, and we don't have them precisely because of the monetary populism of Quizerism. Because of these barbarities. Then, it is also interesting because he says no, the problem is not fiscal, because there is a hypothesis that says that the problem is fiscal because I have a fiscal deficit, I finance it with monetary emission, and that is what generates inflation. And he says no, it has nothing to do with the fiscal deficit. It's funny because he says that then, but the problem is the excess demand for currency that the debt generates for me. I mean, where did the debt come from? It is a box of rest. The debt is the daughter of the fiscal deficit. Ma'am, it's called a budget constraint. Try to see what happens to you when you spend more than you put in. You get into debt. And that pays interest. Let's say that, but that started because you got into debt. And who got into debt for $450 billion? The previous governments, I'm going to tell you something. Moreover, we lowered the debt, with which, let's say, we are doing our job. Therefore, that is, there is also a contradiction in their terms. But of course, they believe that prices are generated by a mark on costs, that is, theory of value, objective theory of value. That is, they went back before 1871. Let me tell you something, I read Menger, and I'm proud to be Austrian. In that sense, it becomes clear why they have caused us so much damage and continue to cause so much damage?
Claro, por qué nos han causado tanto daño y siguen causando tanto daño.
And it's interesting because this kind of stupidity is not only thought by the Quizzerism. There are many more people who think with these things, and these things are the ones that made Argentina, from being the richest country in the world, to fall to the middle of the table. Starting from being the richest country in the world in the last 50, we multiplied poverty at least 10 times. That is to say, in the country that produces food for 500 million human beings, and the treasury takes 70%. That is, the food of 350 million human beings, there are 5 million Argentines who do not have enough to eat. This is the disaster that caused it. It was generated by the entire political caste, not by us who came to fix all these cuttings. And I pass on one more piece of information, because he says no, the fall of GDP, the fall of GDP. It's very interesting. If you take the drop in GDP in the first quarter, which is when we do all the bulk of the adjustment, in fact, we overreacted to the adjustment. GDP in the first quarter fell 5%. I remind you that when Peronism was in power in the year 2002, with an agreement with a man named Alfonso, they took de la Ara, and in that context, it is interesting because they made a much smaller adjustment, and GDP in the second quarter of the year, when they made the adjustment, fell 16%. Therefore, 5% is something quite remarkable compared to the fact that we made a much larger adjustment. But I tell you something, because in the last quarter of the previous year, GDP had already fallen by 2.5%. And when you look at the seasonally adjusted, the first quarter fell by 2.6%, with which, let's say, it was not such an alarming thing. And I'm going to tell you more. The other day I was having dinner with Pablo's teacher, and he made me notice something that I hadn't noticed. And the fact is that if you take the IME, which is, let's say, the proxy for GDP in the monthly version, if you take them seasonally adjusted and take the last observation against December, GDP fell 2%. Therefore, not only are we making the biggest adjustment in history, we are lowering inflation, but also activity did not fall so much. I understand this is very painful for the political caste. We are showing them that they are useless people who serve no purpose, that all they do is harm, and that getting the state out of the way favors us, and is not harmful. It is something that improves our quality of life, not only because of what we gain in freedom, but also because we are more productive and more efficient. But they also predicted that we were going to have a social catastrophe, a catastrophe that we did not have. Why? Because from the Ministry of Human Capital, while we were making the adjustment in items that do hurt the policy today, if you take the universal child allowance plus the alimenter card, today 99% of the basic food basket is covered, when the previous government left it at around 60%. Therefore, our social policy is also much better. But I'm going to give you a fact that is not in that correction. When Minister Tovello decided to take away the benefit of the consideration in social programs, let's say, everyone raised a cry in the sky and says, well, now, let's say they are encouraging vagrancy. They didn't realize what we were doing. Look, what we were doing was very simple. When you gave yourself a social program, although there was a card with which you charged, then you had to go to account for the consideration, and you had to sign it. And that's where the bribe remained. That's where the managers of poverty appeared. Everyone was living filling their mouths that the managers of poverty had to be put an end to. We are the ones who ended up with the managers of poverty. And that was achieved in a battle from the first day that Minister Bullrich gave on the side of street control. Minister Tobello cutting this job because look how interesting, because now if you cut, you did not get paid. And you were not obliged to go to the marches because you did not have to go to give the consideration. That basically the consideration is that you went to the marches to make a mess. So, of course, when we announced that the compensation was being terminated, a few days later, Bellaboni announced a strike. Of course, because we were cutting off the mechanism by which half the money was stolen from the beneficiaries of social priorities. And at that moment, he said that 50,000 were going to go. People, because of course, I thought I was going to go 100,000, and so I showed it as a success. And the truth is that they ended up going no more than 3,000. There were more police officers than people, and that allowed us to gain the street. And besides, you have three types of war. You have the war that is stocks against stocks. He loses the one that runs out first to the bullets, so to speak. There is one that is flow. Let's say there is a dispiole because it never ends. But there is one that is stock and flows. The war that the pickets were posing to us and all this social overflow was flow. That is to say, and the state itself put the money to those who broke things and who said that it was impossible to end the pickets. What did we do? We cut that cable, and it was a battle of flows, the state against the picketers. They ran out of stocks, and the pickets ran out. 4 months ago, what seemed impossible, we have been without a picket line for 4 months. Wow, we are having management. Finally, getting to how monetary policy is going to be for the future, and how the exit from the stocks is going to be back. The first thing you have to understand is that I can't set dates.
De vuelta, lo primero que tienen que entender es que no puedo fijar fechas.
I understand that they have their brains battered by years of collectivism. Has it occurred to any of you to ask the central bank for a year to know where the interest rate is going to be? There is that. I mean truly. That is, they ask us for things. They need to tell us how much the exchange rate is going to be tomorrow at such an hour. Let's say such a minute. I mean, a delusion. In other words, one advances by objectives. And the point is that these achievements depend on the decisions of individuals. Therefore, it is endogenous. That is, when were we able to end the remunerated liabilities? And when individuals wanted to go over to treasury debt. Having said that, we have the broad monetary base, and we have the observed monetary base, the traditional one. So, to the extent that the traditional monetary base, as a result of the increase in the demand for money, leads to the dismantling of remunerated positions, you are not only going to have a situation where the two bases are mapped, but the opposite of that is that the maneuver has been eliminated and inflation is zero. When I talk about zero inflation, again, I say the one that is the difference between the observed and the induced one. When we are in that, the only inflation that will remain is that the observed one is the same as the induced one. And there we can open the stocks. And we don't need dollars because the demand for money is locked in with the money supply. And why is this important? Look at this first, because this is very important. Economic activity, despite what they said, is recovering, and it is recovering in a very interesting way. And that naturally leads to an increase in the demand for money. That increase in the demand for money, what's the matter? Companies need, you have to understand, they need to generate working capital, and if they need working capital, What are they going to do? Are they going to get into debt, or are they going to get out of the money market? When you leave the money market to demand working capital, which is a demand for money, you begin to disarm what? The remunerated positions in the banks, and that is why the banks leave the remunerated positions, and that ask for cash. So that is generating the demand for money to take the traditional monetary base to the broad monetary base. So, what is the big risk here then? It is that we have constantly left the money supply and the demand for money is growing. Obviously, what is happening in the middle is also that the money overhand is being cleaned up. And you are going to have less and less inflation. Once we get to that point, what is the problem now? That the monetary base coincided with the broad one. It is that now the demand for money can continue to grow and the supply of pesos does not grow anymore. And in that case, what is the risk? The risk of deflation. And the problem is that since the speed of adjustment in the financial markets is faster than in the real market, the exchange rate falls sharply for UN leads, let's say, to the bankruptcy of companies and a slowdown in economic growth. And what did we say for this? Competition of coins. Why are we talking about coin competition? Suppose the two currencies were only the peso and the dollar. You can, and in fact, you can do it today. That's why Diarco's case is so wonderful, that he accepts to be paid in dollars. So you guys automatically, what are they generating? They don't have to be throwing the dollars in the market and generating a brutal appreciation. You start making transactions in dollars. The monetization of the economy is going to be done by individuals, as always, and they are going to do it by putting dollars in and making transactions in dollars. And what is the interesting thing about this? That the amount of peso is going to remain fixed, that they are going to have a market exchange rate, that they are not going to experience a jump because supply and demand of dollars are mapped, and as there is more economic growth, you are going to see more and more dollars relative to pesos. And in a moment, the amount of dollars is going to be so much bigger than the amount of pesos, that we are going to be able to close the central bank like this. And this is how the cancer of Argentine inflation is going to end for life. Thank you very much.
We fired the president, and now we are ending the YEF event. I thank you all for participating.